Greetings folks and welcome to the Electromaker Show. This is your midweek roundup of all things maker and embedded and lovely, and no surprises for guessing what we're going to be talking about on this week's show. If you're watching this in the future, the Raspberry Pi 5 was just announced and everyone is very excited about it for what I believe is good reason. However, it's not going to be just Raspberry Pi content today. We're also going to be talking about a new screen that fits on top of the Arduino Giga, which I think is one of the more overlooked recent Arduino boards, and we're also going to be giving away that MQTT Anywhere kit that I talked about on the last week's show, along with talking about a spiritual successor to LTSpice, Rust on embedded hardware, and much, much more. So, let's get on with the show. Yes, perhaps unsurprisingly, we'll be spending a fair chunk of the start of this week's show talking about the Raspberry Pi 5 announcement. And it's an interesting one because Raspberry Pi very rarely does this. They don't usually say, hey, we've got something coming out then. They usually just go, bang, here it is. This time round, they've said it's here, they announced it last week, but it's not going to be here until later this month. I'm recording this in October 2023, in case any of you are watching this from the future. It's an exciting release. And I do mean exciting. I know there's a certain amount of hype surrounding every Raspberry Pi release, but I feel like the technical details of this one really do stack up. And I've said in a few places already that this might be the most exciting Raspberry Pi board release since the original Raspberry Pi. And certainly one of the most exciting things that they've released. The only other similarly significant thing I can think of would be the RP2040 microcontroller, partially because that thing came at a very strange time in our timeline, but also just because it was very interesting to see their own silicon on something. Arguably, the silicon of their own silicon on this board is even more interesting because this board has the RP1 chip on it. Anyway, I am getting ahead of myself. Let's just go through the very basics. So, the Raspberry Pi 5 might not be out yet, but the initial announcement went into a huge amount of detail. I think we know pretty much everything there is to know about it already at this stage. And this blog article by Robin Mitchell on the Electromaker website is the one I will link in the description, simply because all the other things that I'm about to show you are all linked out from here. This very first link links to the Raspberry Pi page we'll be looking at in a minute, and here are various bits of the development diary that we'll get onto in a moment. But first, Pi 5, the overview of the specifications. We have a new CPU that is supposed to be 2 to 3 times more powerful than the Pi 4. Benchmarks that Jeff Geerling has done has shown that across the board it is 2 times or more than 2 times more powerful, and presumably there are ways you can optimize that even further. And this is thanks to the Broadcom chip that Raspberry Pi actually had a hand in putting together. So the BCM2712 integrates a quad-core 2.4 GHz 64-bit ARM Cortex-A76, and this is something that people have already overclocked. I believe Jeff Geerling on Twitter has talked about it. Various people on Twitter have talked about it. It is overclockable. And heat dissipation is something that is also better changed, something we'll get onto in a moment. Now, one of the biggest changes from a user perspective is the fact that it now has a native PCIe slot on it. It uses one of these connectors, and I've forgotten the name of the connector. That's really annoying. A different kind of board-to-board connector, which means that you're going to have some kind of breakout board or a hat to use PCI, but it's that or putting an M2 slot on the board, and I kind of feel like this is maybe a little bit more space conscious. It's going to be better for putting it in different kinds of cases, all that kind of stuff. And yeah, this, as it says here, PCIe and NVMe devices. So that's your NVMe SSDs. That means you now have super high power and high speed storage on your Raspberry Pi powered NAS if you wanted it. But by the same token, you can attach chunky GPUs to it. And once again, I should probably just get that video up so I can keep referring back to it. Jeff Geerling has done that, perhaps unsurprisingly. Jeff Geerling has decided to stick a massive graphics card onto a Raspberry Pi. For those of you that aren't familiar, Jeff has a history of being one of the many people who's trying to get graphics cards working on ARM devices with limited degrees of success. What you also just saw there for a moment in the video is a board that's designed to attach PCIe boards to the Raspberry Pi. That's actually a prototype board he borrowed from Raspberry Pi. There is no hat as yet. I am fairly sure that by the time the Pi 5 appears, there will be a hat for attaching PCIe devices. Now, I'll leave you to go and watch Jeff's video to see how he did with with getting the GPU working. The same with the NVMe hard drives as well. All I will mention is that you can tell the PCIe 2 device on the Pi 5 to act as a PCI 3 adapter, and it works perfectly happily for most things. And he got incredibly high speeds for his NVMe SSD. Once again, you can go and watch Jeff's video, which is the authority on the Pi 5 as far as I'm concerned so far. As always with Jeff as well, everything that he does comes with a blog, and this is a particularly good one once again. Yeah, Jeff Geerling's blog always comes up with something alongside the video that isn't necessarily just the same thing the video says. Anyway, I will be linking Jeff's video in our description, but for now, let's get back to the text side of things. So we got as far as talking about the PCIe connection, and the other thing that you're seeing here is one of the most requested features of the Raspberry Pi for so many years, a power button, an actual power button on a Pi that you don't have to hack in yourself, an on-off button like any other PC, and I'm sure a lot of people will be very happy to see that. For me, it almost feels like a meme at this stage that Raspberry Pis don't have an on-off button, and they almost put it on there just to end the memes. But yes, it's fantastic. And one of the things that is really nice as well is that the case that comes with the Raspberry Pi now, the new Raspberry Pi 5 case, incorporates the power button and the status LED, because right here there is a status LED which is a multifunction LED, so it's an RGB LED in other words, and that all fits inside the see-through power button. So there's just one button, it's not open to the elements anymore, and you can see exactly what's going on with the status LED of your device. Really nice little touch, that. I'm jumping over to the Introducing Raspberry Pi 5 blog on the Raspberry Pi 5 blog. Again, if you want to find this, the first link in this article links through to the announcement page, and I think this is now the third article, because there's a few other things that we're also going to talk about very briefly too. But the Introducing blog has this image, which is a handy one to refer to. It's also just a handy article to refer to in general, incorporating a lot of interesting things. Now, let's look down here. This is a real-time clock slot. Not a real-time clock slot, a real-time clock battery slot. It has a real-time clock on board. You just need to attach power to it. So you could attach a coin cell battery to that. You could attach a supercapacitor to it. You could probably attach the good old Blues Scoop we have been talking about recently as well, the lithium-ion capacitor for this exact kind of thing. And it also has a dedicated UART port, which I know is a massive quality of life increase for some people. If you don't want to work with the GPIOs, the GPIOs are caught up doing something else, having just a dedicated plugin for UART is going to be something that people like a lot. Now, the power management system might not seem like the most fancy thing to talk about, but it's something that I think is worth mentioning, partially because the Renesas part that is on the board was made in conjunction with Raspberry Pi to their specifications. And I want to make it very clear, if I say at any point about voltage conversions here, I am saying something wrong, because it doesn't do that. My power situation for most of my devices has changed radically in recent years, because almost everything I have is USB-C and compliant with power delivery. And since power delivery actually sends messages back and forth saying, hey, what are you? How much power do you need? Can you support this? Can you support that? It makes it incredibly convenient for me. I just have a couple of really quite chunky power delivery systems, and 100 watts here, 100 watts there, and I can plug absolutely everything into them. The Pi 5 runs at 5 volts and 5 amps, and you can get just a regular wall plug that will give it that. The Raspberry Pi official adapter will do that. But the onboard chip negotiates that 5 volts and 5 amps from pretty much any power source. So I'm assuming that I can plug the Pi 5 into any of my normal power delivery outputs, and all of my Pi power issues are gone forever. And I know that might sound ridiculous, because in the past you just needed a micro USB port and a plug that was not going to brown it out. But if you're anything like me, you have lots of cables here, random plugs there, and you never know exactly which one you're going to need at any given moment. I probably spent more time talking about the power IC than anyone else so far in this release. But if you're interested in finding out more about that, there's a bit of information on it in this article from Eben. And let's see, here we are, the DA9091, the Renesas Gilmore Power Management IC. And if you're interested in the gory details, he talks about it a little bit just there. And of course, once you have the name of the part itself, if you really want to look it up, you can. Now, in terms of Wi-Fi connectivity, an interesting thing here, the Pi 5 has exactly the same hardware as the Raspberry Pi 4, but as Jeff Geerling's video here says, he got double the Wi-Fi speeds from it. And I think that's going to be a really good thing for some people, because you don't always have an Ethernet cable where you're working, and if you have something that's quite a high bandwidth operation, if you need throughput with the internet, Wi-Fi can be frustrating, to say the least. And I don't know how they've done this. I'm really interested to find out. I really hope they talk about this in these Raspberry Pi videos that they're putting out about it. And if you're wondering what I mean about these more Raspberry Pi videos, they're going to be putting out more and more content as time passes. We'll be taking a quick look at them in just a moment, but they've already put out 2 more blogs to follow up the initial announcement. And these are going into more details about exactly how it all works. And making Wi-Fi that much better with the same hardware must mean there's been some firmware trickery involved of some kind, and I'm really interested to see if they go into it, just out of pure interest more than anything. It's going to be way above my engineering pay grade. I'm not even an engineer. Now, just before we go on, right in the middle of the board here, you might see a little part laid out that says memory printed on the PCB here. And if you look even closer, you will see that there is a little resistor next to 8G here, and the resistor pads below it are missing. This resistor does absolutely nothing. It is there purely so that you can tell at a glance how much RAM this particular Raspberry Pi has, so you don't have to boot it up or anything, which is such a lovely little quality of life feature. It's such a nice thought. And it also happens to be sitting right next to what I think is the most exciting part of this board by far, the RP1, another piece of custom silicon from Raspberry Pi. And of course, it's not the main processor, but what it does is really quite incredible, and the story behind it is also really quite incredible too. So, the RP1 is a piece of custom silicon from Raspberry Pi, but while the RP2040 was a full-on microcontroller or MCU system on chip, whatever you want to call it, of its own right, the RP1 is a Southbridge. Now, if you're not familiar with the Southbridge, it's a little bit like the I/O controller on your computer. If you're watching this on an Intel computer, AMD and Apple, I'm sure, have their own names for it. It is a chip that takes all of the slower inputs and outputs that don't necessarily need to run at your CPU's main speed, and it handles those inputs and outputs for it. So while your CPU is doing all of the incredibly fast stuff that it needs to be doing at a very certain speed, it can just reach out and say, what are the USB USB ports doing right now? What's happening with the Ethernet port? What's happening on the GPIO pins of the Pi? What's the camera port and the display port doing right now? The RP1 handles all of those things via 4 lanes of PCIe. The 5th lane is the one that they have exposed to us now as the user, which is quite nice. That means there's actually 5 lines of PCIe running to the chip, because presumably that's running straight into the Broadcom chip, but I'm guessing that. But yes, it's super exciting because it's the first major change in the way that the GPIOs work. For the Raspberry Pi 5, it means a massive performance upgrade across the board for what you can do with USB, for example. And one of the super exciting things I haven't mentioned yet, and one of the reasons I didn't mention the camera and display ports right now at the start, is because the camera and display ports can now be arbitrarily controlled. So before you had a display port and you had a camera port, but now you have 2 ports that could be either. So you could theoretically attach 2 MIPI displays to it, or 2 MIPI cameras to it, or one of each like you would before. But yeah, you could have 2 separate cameras attached to the Pi that both are pointing in different directions. I don't know, but again, it's just one of the advantages of having your own custom silicon. And I mean, that's most of the things that people have said about the Pi 5's RP1 so far, and it has just been announced, so I don't know. But if I was to get a little bit kind of off-piste about it and talk about it on a slightly wider point of view, and I know it's something that I'm not the only one that thinks, just because Robin ended out his article by saying something similar to this, that like the idea of this might be, if the release of the Pi 5 teaches anything, it's that custom silicon is the way forward. And custom silicon is potentially the way forward, because the RP1, sure, they developed it for the Raspberry Pi, and the story behind it is amazing. They started developing it in 2015. It's something they've been wanting to do for a long time, and we'll go back to that in just a moment. But if you have this chip that can handle all of your inputs and outputs, and it just requires 4 lanes of PCIe in order to talk to things, does that mean that in the future other creators of single board computers might start thinking, okay, instead of using a completely monolithic chip that does everything for us, why don't we just use a chip that has PCI, and then we'll get an RP1 on the board as well, and that will handle all of our input and output? It's an interesting thought. I have no idea if that is going to be something that happens, but knowing Raspberry Pi, they'll make that chip available, and they'll make it as easy to use for hardware vendors as possible. I'm really interested to see what does happen to it. Now, this has been quite a healthy waffle about the Pi 5 at the very start of the show, but I mean, of course, it was always going to be. Before we move on from the RP1, I mean, I could talk about how excited I am about that forever. The very first link in this article links out to the release of the Raspberry Pi page here, as mentioned, and this middle development diary bit here, I'm in the way of this. This is the introducing the Raspberry Pi article we've been looking at, the one that's behind my head right now. Right next to my head is James Adams and Eben Upton on designing the Raspberry Pi 5. I haven't even had the chance to look at this all the way through yet. But this is a video of Eben Upton and James Adams just having a long form discussion about how the Raspberry Pi 5 came together. And there are so many interesting moments in this. Like the fact that the RP1 started development in 2015. It's an idea that they've been wanting to put together for a long time. It's their longest running and most expensive thing that they've ever put together, which is amazing when you think about all of the different kinds of hardware they put out and the fact they've put out their own microcontroller. And yet this Southbridge, the RP1, it kind of supersedes all of that in terms of the difficulty they've had at putting it together. And I don't know, a 50-minute discussion seems like a lot. It's amazing. It's a lot to get on something that isn't quite out yet. And I can't help but wonder whether that's why they've deferred the release and announced it now, because they held all of this amazing content to, if the hype level wasn't already high, raise it even higher. And just to quickly note, there is also a fantastic article from Alistair Allen, who we've talked to in the past, about heating and cooling on the Raspberry Pi, that tells you how you can check heat from code, how you can change the way that it works via code, and things to do with the new active cooler. One of the things I didn't mention is that the onboard fan plugin now has PWM, so the fan will actually only get up to speed when it needs to. And the way the active cooling works is really interesting too. Once again, Jeff Geerling video, he shows you what happens if you push the Pi without any kind of heatsink or anything on board. It's really quite interesting and quite a nice thing to see. It gives me hope that it's not going to have any of the same heat issues as the Raspberry Pi 4 did. Again, we'll have to wait until they're out and everyone's been playing with them for a while first. Anyhow, I could talk about this for much longer, but I shall not. All that remains to say is that the Raspberry Pi 5 will be coming soon, priced $60 for the 4GB variant and $80 for the 8GB variant. And also, if you look further down this screen, there are a few peripherals that will be making their way out too. The new case, which fits the active cooler inside it. You don't need any modification or anything like that. And as mentioned, it has that nice quality of life feature on the power button. The new active cooler that works via PWM and has the nice heatsink there, and a few other things that we'll probably go into on future shows, like a power over Ethernet shim just there. This is an M2 hat that they're working on right now. These aren't in production as yet. And as mentioned previously, they will be selling their own RTC battery. I imagine you can use a variety of different things for that as well. There's going to be a lot more to talk about on the Pi 5, and I'm sure I will. Just to kind of round up, I did not know the Raspberry Pi 5 was going to be announced. We're not quite at the point at Electromaker now where we're getting things before other people. We're still quite small, and that's fine by me. I was very happy to be surprised by it, if slightly frustrated because I was in a play park with 2 young children and unable to make videos and blog posts and things about it in the moment as I would have liked to have done. But it has allowed me to spend a bit of time just looking at the announcement from an outsider's perspective and seeing what makes it so exciting. Because I do believe it's genuinely exciting. I don't think this is just hype because Raspberry Pi are putting out a new Raspberry Pi. I feel like this is the most thought and innovation that's gone into a Raspberry Pi since they originally came up with the idea of a credit card sized single board computer all that time ago. I occasionally get accused of being too much of a Raspberry Pi fanboy or being kind of sponsored by them to say nice things. Only one of those things is true. I've been a fan of Raspberry Pi since day one for exactly this kind of reason. And I'm really interested to see what other people think of this. If you have any opinion, positive or negative about the Raspberry Pi, you're not going to get flamed or anything like that, please do let me know in the comment section, because I can only speak from my own perspective as an idiot in an attic, but I am, for what it's worth, a quite excited idiot. And yes, I've made inroads into trying to get Raspberry Pi 5 as quick as possible, and this will not be the last you will be hearing about it on our show. If you are one of the many who is going to be getting their hands on a Raspberry Pi 5, please do document how it goes on the Electromaker Projects site. It is not just for finished projects. If you want to put something up there which is testing out the Ethernet as part of a home cluster on the Raspberry Pi 5, or testing out multiple I2C screens on the Raspberry Pi 5, it doesn't have to be a finished project, just an interestingly documented thing that you have done. I would be very, very excited to read them, and of course we'll feature them on the show at some point in the future. But yes, I think that's all the waffling I am able to do in one go about the Pi 5, and it will not be the last time we talk about it on the show. Anyway, I will be linking this article in the description, and you can find out everything that I've just talked about today from this link here. I will also, of course, be linking Jeff Geerling's wonderful video on it as well. Now, the Pi 5 was always going to dominate this show, but there is also some interesting news from Arduino, because they've released their first shield for the Arduino Giga R1 Wi-Fi. Now, I feel like the Arduino Giga R1 Wi-Fi was sort of overlooked a little bit when it first released. I bought one of these with my own money because I got excited about the idea of it, because it's not just a spiritual successor to the Arduino Mega, although it is very backwards compatible in that regard, and it does have the ridiculous inputs and outputs that the Mega does as well. I think all of these inputs and outputs on the outside are pin for pin. I may have that wrong. I have to actually check up on that. But what it does have is an obscenely powerful STM32H7 chip on it. It has Wi-Fi capabilities. The chip has a DAC, and that DAC is connected to the audio output port on it, which, as you may have guessed if you've been watching the show for a while, is one of the things that attracted me to it. It also has a native USB port as well, which again, if you're putting two and two together, yes, the idea was to make some kind of synthesizer on this that could have a USB input for a MIDI device, but also have a ridiculous amount of sensors and lights and flashing bits and pieces on it. It's one of the many things that is on the list of things for me to make for it. However, Arduino have added a specific thing for this, which will make it perfect for people who are wanting to make kiosks and work with machine learning, and that is a touch display with various sensor options on board. So just to give a quick size reference, the Arduino Giga R1 in my hand like this is a little smaller than the Raspberry Pi, but it's larger than any other mainline Arduino board. And I wanted to sort of give this vision of it so that when you see it on the screen like this, you can see the pins that the screen fits into, and it'll give you an idea as to how large that screen is. And of course, we're going to go into the actual measurements of it, as mentioned before, but just a quick plug if there hasn't already been one on this show. If you do want to support the show and you are interested in this, we stock both the Arduino Giga R1 Wi-Fi and the Arduino Giga Display Shield in the Electromaker store. But yes, let's move on to the actual blog post that announced it. So, on the Arduino blog, the Arduino Giga Display Shield. Well, let's start with that. It is a shield, and the way it attaches is quite nice. So the Arduino Giga, if you're not familiar, has all of the usual input and output on the outside that you got from the Mega, but on the inside here it also has connectors for things like displays. And the way the display actually works is it goes through the holes of the board on the back, so that this display can attach to the board and you still have access to all of these on the top, which is a really nice idea, because if you have other shields that you want to combine with this, those shields can go on this side and the display will go on the back. And when I finally get my hands on one of these, which I'm going to hopefully have quite soon, I'll be able to show you that in action, because I also have a hat for this that I haven't shown anyone yet. I'm quite excited about. So the shield itself is a 4-inch display, 3.97-inch display, 480 by 800 pixel RGB touchscreen, a MEMS microphone, a Bosch 6-axis IMU, a 20-pin camera connector, and an RGB LED for blinking lights and fun things like that. And as the short introduction video from Arduino mentions, this is the perfect thing for making some kind of a DIY tablet or handheld, but it's also the perfect thing for a kind of dashboard or perhaps kiosk. In fact, if you put in the fact that you have the MEMS microphone on there already, you have a touchscreen, you have an audio output from the Giga already, you have a USB output as well, there's a number of ways that you could make this work. And with the added grunt of the STM32H7 on board, I'm sure there's a lot of things that you could do with this. Again, you have to remember that you have your normal Arduino IDE way of doing all of this, and of course that's going to make it simple for people like me who aren't necessarily engineers, but this STM32H7 has been used in various ways, and there's a lot of ways you can use, say, an RTOS on this to get things running very efficiently in a very specific way. And I can't really necessarily think of any like touchscreen and development board, just put it together and go thing that's quite as fully featured and competitively priced as this. I will be absolutely willing to be eviscerated in the comments for saying that. If you can think of something that is a better deal than this, obviously do let me know and maybe I'll feature it on the show. Anyway, if you are interested in knowing more about this, please do let me know in the comments of the video. It is something that I'd be happy to come back to, because I have a lot more hype about the Arduino Giga than most other people seem to. Most of the online discourse I've read about it seems to say it's just overpriced compared to other Arduino boards. I happen to think that having a high-priced normal Arduino board is actually a really nice idea, something that isn't in the Pro line, but has enough grunt to do everything that you want it to. There's a reason why I bought this with my own money. But yes, I will be leaving a link to the blog blog post in the description of the video, along with the shop pages for both of these too, and do let me know what you think. If you are enjoying the Electromaker Show, there are a number of things that you can do to support us, and some of those things are completely free. The first one is making sure that you are actually subscribed to our YouTube channel. A huge amount of people watch content that they are not subscribed to, and it does make a marked difference to every YouTube channel that you watch if you subscribe to them. Not only does it turn up in your subscription tab, but it sends a very strong message to YouTube that you would like to see more of this, and it, by proxy, will help other similar channels. And it's the same with clicking like on a video. As much as it's annoying when someone asks you to click like and subscribe and turn on notifications, all of those things serve a purpose, and once again, it shows us that you like the video, but also YouTube. Finally, if you click the little drop-down menu next to the subscribed icon, once you have subscribed, you will have the option to turn on all notifications. This only puts notifications to you in your browser in the YouTube app, and they don't ping or anything. Just in the top right corner of your screen, you will see a little alarm, and if you open that tab, you will get notifications that a particular channel has uploaded something. That's very useful if you're in a position something like I am, where I am subscribed to literally thousands of YouTube channels, many of them maker and programming, some of them gaming, whatever, and there's no way I can keep up with all of them. My subscription box is just too busy, but for particular makers that I really want to see their creations, I turn on subscriptions and they show up in that list for me too. Now, by far the best way you can support this show if you don't want to do any of the YouTube stuff is by shopping at the Electromaker shop. www.electromaker.io/shop, and we stock pretty much everything from everyone, whether you're after a new Raspberry Pi 5 or any of the Arduino line or anything in between, or even if you're up for something very specific, it's definitely worth having a search, and we can do bulk as well if you contact our sales team. We do not run any adverts on YouTube. We do not have any in-show adverts apart from the one that you're watching right now for our own shop. We're supported purely by our own endeavors, as it were. So if you could check that out, that would mean a lot to us. And Christmas is sort of just around the corner. I mean, it's October now. But yeah, if there's someone who you think might benefit from their very first Arduino or Raspberry Pi kit, we also sell those. Anyway, thank you for your patience during this extended self-advert. Let's get back to the show. On last week's show, we talked about the MQTT Anywhere Kit, a fantastic combination of hardware and software to get you started with cellular IoT. I was really excited about this thing. It's basically an Arduino Duo, but it's been modified to have 4 click sockets, and one of the things that you get with the kit is a u-blox module on a click board, and a SIM card that plugs into it, which will allow you to connect via MQTT to ThingStream, which is u-blox's browser-based service. And if you're interested in finding out more about it, links in the description. Robin did an educated video showing a bunch of stuff, including how to get started and how much lower power it uses compared to HTTPS, for example, when it comes to making requests and sending data. And the kit itself is available from the Electromaker store. So why am I revisiting it again? Well, we started talking about it, but we never gave it away. And of course, as with most of the things we talk about on the Electromaker Show, we're going to give it away. And this one's quite a big one. So if you are interested in winning an MQTT Anywhere kit, well, it's the same rules as always. The way we run contests at Electromaker is quite simple. All you need to be is subscribed to this YouTube channel, but you also need to leave a comment on this video saying what you would do with the MQTT Anywhere kit if you won it, and also leave the hashtag MQTT. There's no point entering multiple times. We filter out any multiple entries, but at the end of the week, we will go through all of the entries that are hashtagged MQTT, and we will pick one winner at random. So this is quite a chunky kit that we're giving away. It's quite an amazing thing. I would really love to keep this one and play with it for myself, but as always, we're going to give it away to one of you, and I wish you the best of luck. Now, we're going to move on to a piece of news that I'm sure some people watching this show will be very excited to hear. And for other people, like me, it will be mystifying and strange. And that is to do with Spice Simulation and LTSpice, a much-loved piece of free software that sadly kind of fell out of development for a while, but now it's back under the guise of QSpice. Now, I will be linking this wonderful article by Dave Roundtree from Hackaday in the description of the video, partially because it's a wonderful roundup of what this device is, and partially because Dave knows far more about Spice Simulation than I do. However, I do know that LTSpice is the one piece of software that pretty much every analog circuit designer mentions when it comes to simulation. It was originally given away free, and the thing that makes it interesting is that it's the same developer. QSpice is through Corvo, Qorvo, which is an American electronics company, but Mike Engelhardt is working for Qorvo. And before, when he put out LTSpice, he was the same developer, just working under a different company. So it's probably likely it's going to follow exactly the same ideas. It's free software and it's just going to be updated for the modern age. So for example, there's support for things like silicon carbide, wide bandgap materials. And I said that and almost tripped over it because the idea of wide bandgap material and silicon carbide are things that I simply do not understand at this stage. I am actually thinking of working on a little Electromaker side project called A Noob's Guide to, where me with my non-engineer's brain tries to get my head around these things and gives a rough estimation of what these things are. If that's something you'd be willing to see, please do let me know in the comments. It would give some weight to the idea. Also, behavioral modeling in both Verilog and C++ is something that I think a lot of people are going to find like a really nice touch. But I'm not going to spend any more time on this. If you are interested in LTSpice and have used it in the past, I'm pretty sure you're going to be interested in QSpice as well. And this Hackaday article does something really quite nice. There's a web form that you can go to fill out your details in order to get it. Yeah, I mean, it just takes you to a link that is already available on the public internet. This link downloads the exe file for installing it, which I have done. This is the official exe from getqspice.com/install qspice.exe. It is the official exe from there. I understand if you find that a little bit scary. But yes, I have installed QSpice. I opened up one of the demos and I got lost very, very quickly. I need about a week and that much, about 7 cups of coffee per day to really get my head around it. But yes, if you would like to know more about it, you can head to here. There's also a really nice link out to a tutorial on LTSpice, which is something I could definitely have done with back when I fiddled with LTSpice, when I was trying to design some Eurorack modules a long time ago, and I am no better at analog electronics now than I was then. So, if you are an LTSpice user and you're excited about QSpice, please do let me know in the comment section. And also, if you have no idea what any of this means and would like to know more about it, similarly let me know because, like I said, I'm really interested in learning a bit more about it myself and making an Electromaker noob's guide to things like LTSpice and all of the things involved in this as well. Now, I've talked at length about a number of things on this week's show, so I'm going to keep the last two things incredibly brief so that we don't go too over time, but I want to include them both because they're very interesting. Now, the first is Rust on embedded devices, specifically the ESP32. Omar Hiari and Dev has been doing wonderful work on embedded Rust for a long time. His account goes way back, and it used to talked about STM32 development, so STM32 F4 development using Rust. And way back in the day when Rust was a young programming language, I remember writing about Rust as a journalist and being very excited that the official Rust book already had an embedded section. You could program in STM32. Back in those days, it was still very basic, but it did work. But this one particular article I think is a great place to start. The Embedded Rust ESP Development Ecosystem. It basically talks about the different ways you can work with an ESP32, why he's using the ESP32. He mentioned somewhere in this article, or perhaps somewhere else, that he's been writing things like this for a while, but Espressif specifically support Rust, so there is support for all of the Rust crates for Espressif boards, and the ESP32C3 is the one that he uses in most of his tutorials. And he talks about whether you use no standard development, which is an abstraction layer. Well, this is a perfect thing here, actually. Where's the thing? Yeah. So the no standard library is the peripheral access crate and the microarchitecture crate. These are much more low-level ways of talking to the hardware. And then you have the standard library, or the Rust standard embedded library for Espressif chips. And this is like the hardware abstraction layer, the HAL, that you'll find with STM32 chips, which is either the best thing in the world or the worst thing in the world, depending on who you ask. Anyhow, I am literally going to leave it at that. I'm going to leave a link to this article in the description of the video. If you click on the author's name just here, you will find his page. And I've had a quick skim through a bunch of these. They are really well put together tutorials. If you understand the Rust programming language a little bit, that is a prerequisite. And you know how to program an Espressif board, which is also a prerequisite. You will probably find a lot of interesting things here. This one, for example, is just a really simple thing. How do you make a GPIO button control a blinking LED? How would you do that using Rust? Well, this is exactly that. It takes you through absolutely everything you need to know, including all of the code to implement it as well. And finally, on this week's show, an autonomous self-driving wheelchair. Now, this is from an undergraduate student called KabilanKB, a robotics developer and undergraduate from the Karuna Institute of Technology and Sciences. And as you can see here, this is a normal wheelchair that has been modified to move and has a number of nice things on board. Now, let's jump to the stuff that we're definitely interested in as the embedded people who like this kind of stuff. It uses an Nvidia Jetson Nano, which is the lowest powered yet still pretty grunty single board computer from Nvidia for AI. And connected to that is a LiDAR and a depth camera. And then there's an Arduino, which is doing things like controlling the motors and things like that. And it's got a bunch of really interesting features. As it says here, it's mapping its area. And in fact, if we look at the actual blog post from the maker themselves, you can see some of that happening here. Now, I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail as to how it was put together, because some of it will be somewhat obvious and some of it is definitely worth reading from the author themselves. While Nvidia have just put this blog post out right now, there's actually been an article from the maker on the Medium since July. I'm only hearing about it now because Nvidia have kind of signal boosted it. But it's the project itself is super interesting and a great idea. But one of the things about it that I find really interesting is not just the concept itself, but how well suited it is to a medical environment. So hospitals are interesting buildings because they are designed to be accessible by nature. Almost every aspect of a hospital has to be accessible by wheelchairs and by people in stretchers. And not only that, hospitals are generally built around routines and set routes. Usually you just need to go from A to B in a hospital building. Most parts of the hospital will be of a similar idea in terms of the layout of the hospital floor by floor. And once you have actually set routes for a wheelchair to follow, it knows the routes to get from one part of the hospital to the other, then all it has to do is obstacle avoidance. And that's where the LiDAR, the depth camera, and of course the AI-assisted SBC on board come in. It's a really interesting prototype for that reason, because this particular thing in and of itself isn't going to be putting hospital porters out of the job anytime soon. And I don't think anybody thinks that. But the kind of things that undergraduates are working on right now, the prototypes and the proofs of concepts, really are going to start popping up and showing up in places. After all, this is the same kind of autonomous technology that is slowly being incorporated into cars that will be driving on our roads, some of which are already doing so to a limited extent. And as it says here, there are already, AI tractors and baby strollers. I remember talking about this one a while ago, which is sort of interesting. I remember, CES 2023. I thought it was earlier than that they mentioned a smart stroller. Maybe this is the newest version of a smart stroller. But again, this is a stroller that can drive itself. And autonomous vehicles are things that always polarize people in terms of what they think. Should they be allowed? What are the ethical considerations if someone in a wheelchair that is autonomous gets punted out of that wheelchair by a software error? Who's to blame then? There's a lot of questions like that. But the technology behind it is fascinating, and it is going to be finding its way into more and more spaces as it uses less and less power and requires less processing to do. And Nvidia, as always, are kind of at the forefront of all of this. Once again, we have no affiliation with Nvidia whatsoever. I just had a Jetson Nano and have had one for years, and even just the very mild messing around with the Jetpack SDK, I think their SDK is called, was incredible. Very easy to get things up and running, and I could see myself quite simply putting together, okay, A fits to B, and that's kind of how it works. It's all quite easy to use. If you are interested in finding out more about this, I will link the Nvidia article here. I will also link the actual blog post from the maker themselves. And if you are interested in more things like this, there's a huge amount of autonomous stuff out there and projects. And I could do a general looking into what autonomous stuff is coming next once a month or something like that, if it's the kind of thing that people would be interested in seeing. But when Nvidia puts these kind of press releases out, it is always interesting because obviously Nvidia themselves see this as something that they think is worth the world seeing. And Nvidia, who are at the forefront of this kind of stuff, are obviously going to dictate that to some extent. If you do head to either one of the links, consider following KabilanKB on Medium, as I'm sure they will be updating us with their projects in their own words anytime now. So that was our show for this week. Thank you so much for joining me. Thank you for the continued support that you are all showing us. The Electromaker channel continues to grow, and it makes me so happy to know that we're reaching more and more people. And there are people interested in hearing me waffling in an attic about things that I am very enthusiastic about. And boy, am I enthusiastic about the Pi 5. I hope that came across in this show. We are still in a position where we're not really on the same level as some other people. I didn't have access to a Pi 5 before it came out. I've got a couple on the way to me right now because I've made sure that I'll get my hands on one as soon as possible, and we'll be talking about it more in the future. I'm really interested to hear your opinion on the Raspberry Pi 5. It's by far the biggest news of the year so far. And yeah, I've already seen a bit of division in the opinion. What with the shortages that happen for such a long time, what with the price differences and all this kind of stuff. And then on the other side, I've seen people kind of saying, well, yeah, but I mean, if they manage to get this one out and people can get their hands on it, the price is very, very fair and the performance is incredible. If all of this is as good as it looks, then how can you say that this is bad? And I'm certainly more in that team than the others. I've generally been quite enthusiastic about Raspberry Pi, even in the darkest of times. And this has just cemented that I think they make lovely things, frankly. Yes, anything from the show and anything you think should be in the show or I've missed, please do leave in the comments section. We also have our Discord server. You can find a link to that in the YouTube description notes just here. We'd love to have you there. I'd love to get a nice little community of people working in there as well. Just a quick note, if you want to put your project up on Electromaker, or you want to work on a project to put on Electromaker and you don't know how, the Discord server might be a good place to start. If you head there and describe what your problem is, the chances are there might be someone in there that can point you in the right direction. Anyway, that was a long and waffly outro, wasn't it? I hope you're having a safe, fun and creative week, and I will chat to you very soon. I will chat to you very soon. Wait, that sounds terrifying. Ian. Sometimes when you talk to yourself in an attic for long enough, you say something just weird.